What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video and you're watching us currently on YouTube, please do me a favor and hit the like button and let me know what you think of today's discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living in Iraq and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit Down video. If you're checking us out currently through our audio platforms on Google Pod, Spotify, or iTunes, welcome in. I hope you enjoy the show. As always, we always have a boisterous audio group through the podcast. Hope you're having a great week. Make sure you leave us a detailed review and give us 5 stars if you're enjoying the show. Many of you have done that, and I greatly appreciate it. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? We are back with another episode of the Sit Down. This is episode 114, and I'm your host, Jeff Nadu. I hope you had a great 4th of July holiday. 4th of July is always nice. You don't have to get any gifts for anybody. Just hang out, maybe have a nice meal at a barbecue, and enjoy summer, which before you know it is over. So time's turning here as always. But 4th of July was a good holiday. Today we have another great episode planned for you, as always, on organized crime. Today we're going to get into a very famous last name. But we're going to talk more about one of them, one that we don't talk about as much. We'll get to that in just a second. Before we do that, though, I want to tell you all about MyBookie. Now, I've talked to you about MyBookie before, and it really is a great place because it allows you to essentially play your favorite casino games, bet on sports, and you can do it all in the comfort of your own home. I've talked before. Look, I got my start in this business in gambling through sports betting. I played poker. That was kind of some of the early start for me in gambling. And one of the favorite things that I've really begun to like as I've grown older is blackjack. Blackjack is a great game. It's something easy to learn. You could play roulette, all sorts of things. But MyBookie really offers you that safe spot in your house. You don't have to go to the casino. You can do it all from your own home. And their new and improved online casino is here to change the game. You can dive into truly realistic casino experiences featuring the latest in slots, progressive jackpots, and they even have live dealer action. And like I said, you don't have to go with the wife to the casino. You don't got to make your trek to an actual brick and mortar building. You could do it in your house. You could take advantage of things like weekly blackjack tournaments and a brand new collection of high-end games for a chance at, yes, real cash rewards. It provides you a Las Vegas experience where your actions in your hands. And the part is you don't even need to wear pants. Now, I have said before, I don't wear pants sometimes when I do this show. Now, I know that might not be the greatest visual for you, the listener or viewer, but you could play blackjack, slots, whatever you want. You don't have to do that. Your adventure at the MyBookie Casino begins today. And what I'm going to do, as I've said before, we like to give you things in this show. And on the bottom, if you're viewing it on YouTube, you can see the little promo code. We're going to give every listener a promo code to MyBookie right now. All you have to do to get that generous sign-up bonus is use promo code SITDOWN. Again, that's promo code SITDOWN, all one word, to secure yourself a sweet deposit bonus. And they'll match it, again, $1,000, 50% up to $1,000. You're also going to get a $10 casino chip. Remember, that's not all, because their revamped loyalty program ensures that you'll be showered with rewards, including free spins, cashback offers, and a host full of exclusive VIP perks. The more you play, the more you win. So be like me, be like a lot of people. Go check out MyBookie Casino right now. Play anytime, anywhere. And again, by listening or viewing the show, you're going to get a promo code. Use promo code SITDOWN. Go play blackjack. Go play roulette like me and try to win now. MyBookie.ag. Like I said, I hope everyone had a great holiday. I expect this week, my birthday is next week, next Monday, and we'll take all gifts. So make sure you send them. I know many of you like to gift, so make sure you do that. That said, let's get into today's episode. And, I'm asked an interesting question on this show all the time. I might get this question 2-3 times a week. Where is blackjack? Okay, many people say the golden age of this show was when Blackjack and I did like 50 or 60 straight episodes where we just picked someone each week and we did a bio on them. And that's something we've always done here. It's no frills, no nonsense. It's just straight crime content. And I figured we got to start bringing him back. We got to start getting him back in the fold. And he's here now. Blackjack Fletcher, our old friend, is here. Look at that shirt, pink and purple. You got to love it. Blackjack, as I said, the golden age of the show is when you and I just, pumped out episodes each week. You've been away. You've been doing your thing. You weren't at college, like they would say in the mob. You're just doing your business. You have a life. And I think we're going to try to get you back on pretty frequently. How you been, bro? How's everything going?
No, I'm doing great, Jeff. I'm doing great. It's always a pleasure to be back here on the sit down, as you and the many listeners have said. The golden age is when you and I are together. We just make magic, I'm looking forward to getting back on here on a more regular basis. Now that you're out from the chains.
Yeah, well, good point. And I think we're back to really the golden age, right? We're just, doing things each week. It's very simple, very easy. Now, for anyone that doesn't know, Blackjack, we've talked about this before. You were a defense attorney for a long period of time, get out of that business, went into another one. She always offered an interesting legal look. And today we have a person that has, before his death, tried to get out of prison many times. And there's always a good kind of connection whenever we talk. So it's good to have you back. I also want to thank last week, Gary Jenkins for coming on. I know, guys, a lot of the time, some of the families out in New York are not as popular as the five families, but it's important that we always have a various group of different shows here. We can't every week talk about the Gottis or Chin Giganti, right? You got to get into other things, and that's what makes this show great. We have a variety. We have a great anthology. But today, Blackjack, we're going to talk about Peter Gotti. And we're going to really just signal Peter out. I have to say, this is one of my favorite mugshots. This is when Peter was arrested in 1991 in the Windows case. It's funny. He's wearing that Sergio Tacchini, which has made a big comeback with the tracksuit game. But, Peter Blackjack is an interesting character. There's a lot of things that we don't know about him. Obviously, his brother John got most of the spotlight. Mm-hmm. Gene was someone who, I think if you know John and you know some of the things that he was all about, he loved Gene. He looked at Gene as, when I'm not around, Gene's going to be my guy. But Gene was always in prison, and Peter ended up kind of just being the guy that ended up doing some of the collections and ultimately became boss. But one thing I kind of want to talk about on this show today is one thing we've learned, and we've learned about this through Mikey Scars and his show and some of the other things, is that John Gotti talked negatively about everyone. Right. And he regarded Peter as an imbecile and a moron and a dumb guy. And I kind of want to understand, was he actually a dumb guy, or was he just kind of just a guy who was always there? He was always willing to support his brother and be loyal. Peter Gotti, Blackjack, is an interesting guy, though, isn't he?
Yeah. I mean, like you said, it's funny in some ways, when you said you wanted to talk about him today, you do a little thinking in your head, and it's like he's kind of the forgotten Gotti in a lot of ways. Like, you got to really think about him a little bit to get into it. But I mean, listen, at the end of the day, he might not be the first or the third or even the fourth Gotti that you think of when you hear that name. God was the boss at one point. I mean,
exactly. And I think
that's that away from him. He was the boss.
I think that's like the growing thing is like, look, I get he was like considered kind of an oaf, kind of a jovial guy, and he's just kind of there to collect and be his brother's kind of liaison in prison. But, again, I mean, he did have standing in the street, right? And look, we'll get into the fact a lot of people didn't respect Peter Gotti, but you don't get to this point through sheer just, whatever. But let's get into it. I mean, a lot of people don't realize the oldest brother in the Gotti family was Peter. Let's get into it. Peter Gotti on the sit down. Peter Charles Gotti was born October 15th, 1939 in the Bronx, New York. As we know, the Gotti family had many sons. The most known was obviously John Gotti. There was a brother, Richard Gotti, up on the right, Vinny Gotti on the left, as well as Gene Gotti. We know that he would enter the life as well, but most of his career in the streets was in prison. And then you have Peter, the eldest. Now, we've talked in years past on this show about the forgotten Gotti brother, Bill Gotti, who, didn't go into the life. And there were various sisters as well. But Peter Gotti was the oldest. He was about a year older than his brother, John. And the Gotti family would eventually, in the early 50s, move to East New York, Brooklyn. And this map is interesting because notice it's you know, kind of essentially just west of Ozone Park. Canarsie is right near there. This is kind of a breeding ground for the Mafia, right? We know that the Gambino family, Blackjack, over the years has been very involved in Howard Beach, Ozone Park, and the early East New York crew, that Carmine Fatico crew, you know, this is where the Gottis kind of came up, right? This is where young John Gotti was involved with Fulton Rockaway boys, where you meet Angie Ruggiero and all these different people. Peter Gotti was the eldest, but early on, it really seemed like he was trying to kind of maybe go a straight way in life, which is what we learned about some of the Gottis. Some of them tried legitimate work. Now, the thing we learn is Gene and John were different, right? They were street guys, right? In the 60s, they're coming up as hijackers and stuff like that. But we would learn, Blackjack, that Peter actually got a job at an unlikely place.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the funny thing about the Gotti family to me, Jeff, is what you just said, that some of them go legitimate, some of them go a different way. Another thing that gets overlooked about that family, the mother, Philomena, deserves a medal. That woman was pregnant, what, 13 times?
A lot of kids,
I mean,
yes.
The woman spent her entire life pregnant. I don't know. I don't know how she did it, but credit to her.
Well, I've said before, my father is one of 15. And you know, it's funny, if you ever saw my father's mother, she was, I mean, barely 5 foot tall, a little woman, probably barely weighed 100 pounds. And I have to remember when I went and saw her as a kid, I would think to myself, like, as I got older, I would realize, like, wow, you know, she's kind of a saint, man. Like, for having, like, that's not, you don't hear that much anymore.
You're
like
pregnant nonstop.
Yeah.
For like, yeah. I don't know, almost 2 decades. It's crazy town.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, again, like when you look at these old families back then, like even ones like in New York, like the Gottis, I mean, they lived in abject poverty because there was no, I mean, that's a lot of kids. 5 kids is a lot to support, let alone, you know, 3 times almost that amount. So, you know, I think anytime you're in an ethnic or immigrant community, the goal is, you know, you go out and try to get a civil service job or something like that. And we learned that. Like one of the Gotti brothers was a groundskeeper at Yankee Stadium at one point. But Peter Gotti in the 60s and 70s would actually become a member of the Department of Sanitation in New York. He would have a legit job. He created a pension for himself. But in 1979, it was characterized that he fell off the back of a truck. Now, we know that in mob terms, that generally means that you're stealing.
Yeah, lots of stuff fall off trucks.
But for Peter Gotti, he would fall, hit his head, and he was awarded some penalties and some pensions, disability. And keep in mind that pension's important because that comes back to really haunt Peter Gotti's wife in the mid-2000s. She begins to attempt to collect that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But Gotti tries to go straight. Now, I think you and I have talked before about, you kind of wonder what the dynamic is in that family, right? Yeah. Because 2 of your brothers are, you know, by 1979, they're both made members in the Mafia. Gene Gotti was the first brother made in around 1977. John's made right after. So they're high-ranking members. And we know that Carmine Fatico essentially put John Gotti in control of the Bergen crew before he was even made, right? He was very respected. So I always wondered about the dynamic. Let's say it's 1978, Blackjack, and the Gotti family have some sort, like it's Christmas, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
What is that dynamic between Peter and John and Gene? Because it's like, I'm a Department of Sanitation worker, and we would probably arise that, I don't know this for a fact. Obviously, I didn't live with these people, and I don't know every single detail, but we would have to admit maybe Peter was involved with some bookmaking or something, but he's not to the level of these guys.
No, yeah, I mean that's the fascinating thing to think about, right? Is like, what do those holiday get-togethers look like? You got all these kids, wives, their kids hanging out, and you know it's 1978, like you said. Everyone's bitching about Jimmy Carter and inflation, a lot like today. And meanwhile, John's got a guy driving for him outside, you know, and shows up in like a $3,000 suit. I don't know. It's got to be awkward as hell.
Right. And they're the power of the neighborhood, right? They are up and comers. They are the next in line. I did a show a couple of weeks ago about Mikey Scars Di Leonardo. And at one point, a very old school capo in the early 80s, okay, this is before Paul was assassinated, everything. He told Mikey Scars, a very young Mikey Scars, he says, that guy, John Gotti, that's our next boss. They knew for years beforehand John Gotti was going to be the next guy in line. Okay. Take away the movies. And look, we have talked positively about John Sr. We've talked negatively about John Sr. I don't sugarcoat it. I try to tell you the truth. But in the end, there's very few people that could argue the level of gangster he was. He was personified. Everybody loved him. And in the dynamic of Peter, it's got to be really interesting. But as I've said before in this show, and what I find with all these people is their careers are their lives are picked out for them, right? You've got to be a really strong individual to be someone like Peter Gotti to say, I'm not going into that world, right? It's just not, it's always going to come back and it's always going to find you full circle.
I mean, the lure is just, I would imagine the lure is incredible, especially back in that time. Like, it's easy to look at now in 2023 and be like, yeah, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't. Back in the 70s, man, it was the golden age of crime in this country.
Right.
I say it all the time, not just organized crime, but like, you see the proliferation of serial killers in the 70s. You had all the benefits of a modern society without constant surveillance, cell phones, tracking, DNA. None of that stuff was around, man. Unless someone saw you commit a crime, you get away with it. The lure had to just be, I mean,
the lure of, and the lure of the mob really was we talked about golden age with this show. The golden age of the mob, is a long period of time, but it really lasted into the 80s. I mean, like late 70s, that was the time, and you're in control of the Gottis at this point of a pretty large swath of people, a large swath of an area. So what does Peter Gotti do? He gets injured. He trades in the trash truck for the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, which had been around for years. As I mentioned, when Carmine Fatico became a capo, he had been marred by legal problems his whole life. In the mob, he kind of just ushers the Gotti regime in, and Gotti takes over, and they do business out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. Now, I do want to talk again. John Gotti looked at Gene Gotti as he is my, not protege, but him and I are thick as thieves, right? Yep. We are the strength of this family. And if you've ever heard John speak, what does he always regard his other brothers, whether it's Peter, Vinny, Richie, pee-pee brains, idiots, morons. The one guy I've never heard him talk negatively about was Gene, right? Yeah. So that kind of shows you the level of what he feels. Look, John Gotti knew he was going to go to jail forever eventually.
At some point, or he was going to get killed.
Right. This is what makes John Gotti on a different level than like whether or not he was a great boss. This whole mantra of I am a gangster and this is my life and I take what comes to me. I don't look for retirement. I don't look for cooperation. This is who I am, and I'm going to take a bullet. I'm going to tell you to do it right when the bullet malfunctions. That's the kind of I will die for this.
I mean, listen, John Gotti. Yeah, he said it many times that he was dying in a cellar of ox or going out with a bullet. There was no scenario where John Gotti died in his own bed.
No, that for all these guys, that was the end. Look, I know you can bring up like a Carlo who was, 1 in a million, Tony Accardo, people like that. You either are Paul Castellano in front of Sparks, or you are Tony Ducks, Fat Tony, John Gotti, Vinny Gigante, where you're dying in prison.
That's it. And by the way, can we just, since we're talking about conversations that have to be awkward, you mentioned what John's view of a lot of his brothers, most of them were idiots. It doesn't help when you come to him and say, hey, John, I need a job. I fell off a garbage truck.
Right.
I mean, you're not doing yourself any favors.
Well, the one thing John and all these old guys wanted to do, these stone cold gangsters, is they wanted to continue building these groups, right? And who better to surround you with as like your gopher, driver, bodyguard than your brother, right? Because look, whether or not you respect Peter Gotti, like he was just kind of a weird guy, but he was a jovial guy. People, I think, liked him probably. He was an imposing guy. Look, you have the name Gotti, you're imposing. It doesn't matter whether you can fight or kill or not. People are just going to run the other way when you come. And I think what we can find by surveillance photos is, Peter's a formidable guy. The regular citizen is going to be scared of him. So he's a good person to have around. He did what he was told. He picked up stuff. He was trusted. And that's one thing. You can always trust your blood more than pretty much everyone. And I think John realized that. Now, I want to talk about a story we don't talk much about when we talk about the Gottis. And this is a really interesting story. It involves the daughter of Peter Gotti, a woman called Linda. Okay. In 1981, Linda Gotti, young 20-something, she's coming up at Ozone Park. She has a boyfriend, John Diegnese. Okay. From all accounts, nice guy, worked in and out of a bar called the Shamrock Bar here in Queens on Jamaica Avenue. So they're there one night, her boyfriend. There was a bartender in the place that night. Some sort of spilled drink happens, okay? And this turns into a real mess. Her boyfriend's killed alongside another man, and she's in the building that night, which is a big problem, right?
Yeah, I would say so.
So from all encompassed thoughts are down the road, this murder goes unsolved for a long period of time. Linda Gotti is approached by the federal government on, who she saw that night. She speaks and identifies who it is. Now, remember, Linda Gotti is just a citizen. She just happens to have a father and an uncle who are gangsters, and plenty of gangsters. The Gotti family is supposed to be incensed. Now, I want to make this clear. This comes from the New York Daily News. I know some Gotti family members don't always like some of the things I say. This comes directly from them. And the wife of John Gotti, according to them, law enforcement says she supposedly has some sort of call with Linda Gotti and says essentially, you don't have to testify, right? Kind of leaning on her in a way, right? Mm-hmm. They don't testify, blah, 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 blah. Because the person and people that committed this murder that night, this double murder, were supposedly members and associates of the Gambino crime family. This individual was supposedly involved, Bobby Glasses Vernaise. So this is shut up, you're a Gotti, you don't talk. Now, I want to talk about the quote that supposedly Victoria Gotti, John Gotti's wife, says to Linda Gotti. Sources say that Gotti told the prosecution team she was surprised when she saw her dad, Peter Gotti, at Diegnese's wake, since she had never told him they were dating. And she would also tell prosecutors she was subpoenaed by Queens prosecutors to testify a few years after, and that her Aunt Victoria, John Gotti's wife, told her, quote, you don't have to testify if you don't want to. And that her aunt maybe wanted to protect someone, according to sources. Now, I do want to make this clear. Victoria Gotti, John's wife, denies that this ever took place and that she personally called John Marzulli, a veteran reporter for the Daily News, and said, quote, this never happened. So this is something over the years we've found out. Certain female members of the Gotti family will call directly and say stuff didn't happen. We don't know if it happened or not.
No, all speculation.
But surprisingly enough, guess who never testified or took the stand? Linda Gotti. Okay. So somebody got through to her, right?
I mean, listen, and I'll say this, that could be for any number of reasons, right? I mean, we're speculating here what they are, but the reality is, I mean, maybe if your last name is Gotti, you just have an aversion to testifying on behalf of the government. And
maybe she just decided, you know what? Yeah, I don't want to talk, and that's her prerogative, right? That's
you keep that in-house.
Say that again.
Maybe you keep it in-house. Maybe that's an internal matter.
Sure, absolutely. And that is gleaned from what happened here. Ultimately, though, down the road, Bobby Glasses was found guilty. Multiple people testify against him, and he was serving life until his death. So kind of an interesting story involving Peter Gotti. But by this point, Peter Gotti's making his way. He's collecting payments. He's doing what he does. Now, one thing I found interesting about Peter Gotti is there is all sorts of proof about John Gotti, Gene Gotti, Junior Gotti, all sorts of different people becoming made members. I have, through a lot of different sources, I have no proof of when Peter Gotti was made. But I was told from RJ Roger, who's connected to Mikey Scars. He would tell me that they believe Peter Gotti was probably made post Castellano. So we could probably venture between 86 and 88, because we find out that in 1989, Peter Gotti is elevated to capo regime of the old Bergen crew. Okay, so he gets his own crew. And look, like John's son, probably because he was related, right? He was a guy that I think this was probably the top level we would expect Peter Gotti to be in, right? Yep. Capo regime, in control of a couple of guys, and that's it. Peter Gotti would also be seen regularly with his brother John, walking in and out of court, on the street corner. Here he is talking with some sort of female outside of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. We would also see him in surveillance. At one point, there's video surveillance where he offers to buy ice cream for federal agents in front of the Ravenite Social Club. He's all over the place, right? Very jovial guy. Have you ever seen him talk? Hey, how you doing? He was funny. He came across likable. There was a TV skit, a Mad TV skit, where a comedian sends a clown with balloons to the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, and Peter Gotti answers the door and, basically says that John's not here right now.
Mad TV.
Yeah, it's actually pretty funny. Peter laughs it off kind of, right? He seemed, whenever you see him, pretty jovial, right? Mm-hmm. Kind of just no nonsense, didn't take life that serious, and was pretty liked. His crew at that time would include Skinny Dom Pizzonia, Fat Salvatore Scala, Thomas Monk Sassano, and Ronnie One-Arm Trucchio. Now, this crew is interesting because Pizzonia is allegedly someone that acted as a backup shooter in the Castellano. He was down the street. He was also indicted for multiple murders, including the Rob the Mob crew. Supposed that he was the triggerman in that, alongside Trucchio, who was serving a life sentence. And Fat Salvatore Scala was actually allegedly the triggerman in Tommy Bellotti during the Castellano hit. He, alongside his brother-in-law, Eddie Lino, were tasked with that, allegedly. Now, that murder was never solved, but that's speculation from multiple people that were involved. Now, Blackjack, there was an interesting comment made recently by one of the former attorneys for John Gotti, a person called Anthony Cardinale. I wanted to throw this in. He would say recently that there's no actual proof John Gotti was involved in the hit on Paul Castellano, and that it could just be speculation. But he's not wrong. There is no actual proof, I guess.
I mean, I don't know. What would you consider actual proof? Security camera footage? Like, I don't know, man. It's pretty, the parties involved have all, for whatever you think about Sammy, he's talked about it.
Well,
a lot of guys have talked about it.
I guess something we can say about Counselor.
It's possible, but let me ask you this, Jeff. If John Gotti wasn't involved in it, how the hell does he become boss?
Well, that's the question.
Someone else did it.
Here's what I'll say to Counselor Cardinale, right? He's not wrong. Because look, if you look at, let's say, the Idaho murder case, right? Which
I've been following you on this one.
Yeah, if you actually look at the physical evidence, nothing places him there other than a small microbe of DNA that could have been garnered from something else and placed there. We don't actually know. And there is multiple DNA around the home of other males. Okay, but
that's a separate thing on this, because
we are going to do it,
but dig into that with you.
But that said, when you look at and I'm just backing up what Cardinale. It's very interesting. It's ridiculous, but interesting. But you're right. Gotti takes over. So Peter at this point is in control of the Bergen crew. Pretty legendary crew. So yeah, things are working out for Mr. Gotti. Now, in and around this time, he becomes capo. He does have to deal with some legal issues. Peter and Gotti would be indicted in the very famous Windows case. Now, we've talked about this case. This involved the installation of housing project windows in the over 300 housing projects in New York, and that the mob was essentially charging about $2 a window on every window. So it's a lot of windows. It was said the mob made hundreds of millions of dollars, and all five families are picked up in this. Benny Eggs, Vic Amusa, all these different people. Peter Gotti actually beats the rap in this case. He's acquitted on all charges. So he's never been to prison, right? All this time, never been to prison. And things are pretty good for him. He has a wife at home. He had been married to a woman called Catherine since the 1960s. He had several children. Things were good for Peter Gotti. The problem is, eventually he has to deal with the fact that his brother is facing prosecution. As we know, in the early 90s, by 1992, John Gotti is indicted, and this is a case he cannot beat. We all know that. We don't have to go into this story. He is sent to prison in 1992. And what John Gotti does that's very smart, a lot of people don't give him credit for this. We know that he installs his son, right, as the final decision maker, John Gotti Jr., who's a capo at this point. He's the last decision maker in the family. But what he also does, John Gotti, is he puts Jackie Knows, his confidant, on a panel, as well as Peter Gotti, as well as James Failure, Jimmy Brown, who's one of the most senior members of the family. So John basically creates a committee of the most respected people, or most of the respected people. But the last decision maker was Junior, which we would probably have to imagine probably angered people. But I guess for Jimmy Brown, who was very adept, he realized, let him take all the shit. I'm a senior guy. I'm making a ton of money. Things are good.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's a smart thing to do, right? Because I whatever you think about Junior and his tenure as boss, I don't know that it was in anyone's plans to have him take the reins when he did. It was more out of necessity than anything else. So by putting this group of people who have a lot more experience and just life experience, right, and people whose judgment you really trust, it kind of puts you in a position to really grow, right? It's like hiring a first-time head coach in the NBA and sticking a guy, like Mike D'Antoni next to him, right?
Like an assistant, right?
It gives you that kind of support system to go through the growing pains.
Plus, it makes everyone else in the family that are loyal to other people happy. Everything's good. So that was a smart thing to do by John. Now, according to Mikey Scars DiLeonardo, he would say as well that at one point, he was kicking up most of his construction proceeds to Junior and Peter Gotti. In fact, the local 23 that he was in control of, he directly says in his testimony that he gave money directly to Peter Gotti. And that Peter Gotti was kind of next in line. So whenever Junior went away, the thought was Peter would probably be in some sort of control aspect of the family. Now, what we most know about John Gotti's trip to Marion and his involvement in that institution is various jailhouse conversations that he has. Now, we see a lot of them. We see, and these are grainy pictures, but we see John, obviously, and then we see his daughter, Victoria, and then Peter to the right. Yeah. Now, Peter essentially acts as a liaison a lot of the time. He goes out to Marion to visit John. This is pre-cancer for John. This is like 97, 98, because Peter is still on the committee, but Junior's in control of the family until like 1999. But this is where Peter Gotti starts getting in some really stupid things, right? This is where he kind of does himself in. Now, we've heard the conversations involving John and his daughter. At one point, he rambles on about, they don't come and see him and all sorts of stuff. He then tells Peter at one point, quote, "I told you, I don't want you to bring these fucking people here anymore. I laugh all day. I'm in a good frame of mind till I see them. Fuck you, and fuck them." So he gleams that at one point he is not happy with his family. Keep them away from me. And he talks about how he gets pictures from like Idaho and all these different people that would just be happy to see him at one point. And why doesn't his family do anything? He also tells his daughter at one point where she complains to him about people think that they're animals, like people at their school and stuff. And he says, well, that's you. You're the one that's on TV. Take your husband's name, and then your kids wouldn't have to deal with it. To which she gets up and walks away. And when he says that, now more of the nefarious conversations involve John and Peter, where Peter is told to come alone and he comes alone. In 1997, there's a quote that John says to Peter where he essentially says, there's a debt that still needs to be paid. Okay. Now this is in reference to this individual, Sammy Gravano. Okay. Now we did a show last week last Saturday on Angelo Prisco, who was a Genovese member, and we heard him on wiretaps discussing the moronic thought to kill Sammy Gravano after he testifies. What sense does that make? It just brings unnecessary nonsense to you, and you're not going to probably get to him anyway. Don't you kill him before he cooperates? The plan, according to the government, was that there's a debt that needs to be paid, is basically John telling Peter, you need to kill Sammy. Okay, he needs to go. You know, he calls him all sorts of names. So I guess I'll ask you as a defense attorney, right? What sense would it make to kill Sammy Gravano after the fact?
Well, it wouldn't make any rational sense, but you've got to remember, if I'm a guy sitting in federal prison
You
for
want
my
retribution.
life, I want the guy who put me there. Okay, I want him. I don't really care. I mean, listen, I'm not going to say that John didn't care about what happened to anyone on the outside who was doing it, but I'm going to say that that's probably not part of the thought process, right? The thought process is, fuck that guy. He did this to me. I want him.
Well, and this is the precarious spot that Peter Gotti put himself in, right? Because he could have just been, you know, a sanitation worker, maybe took some gambling bets or did some things. By yourself and elevating you to making all the money you were making and getting the things you got, eventually your brother, who's doing life and doesn't care about a conspiracy to commit murder because he's already doing life, you're now put in a precarious situation. But you, Peter Gotti, we know, took the oath and decided that you're going to do what's told of you, right? So allegedly, Peter Gotti puts this in motion. Okay, he goes to Huck Carbonaro and this guy, Fat Sal Mangiavellano, who's recruited by Carbonaro. Now, Carbonaro had been a lifelong friend to Sammy. They were in the same crew. He believed, Peter, allegedly, that Huck could get to Sammy. Now, we would learn about the plot on Sammy Gravano, and it's actually quite interesting. According to Fat Sal Mangiavellano, who would ultimately cooperate, he would say that he was given, quote, unlimited money to make this happen. And we would learn that the Gambino family spent about $70,000 to find out where Sammy was in Arizona. And Fat Sal would say that they had all sorts of ideas on how to kill him, but they needed to be careful because he was a killer as well. Mm-hmm. And right, look, if someone says, hey, I'm coming to kill you, the great equalizer is you have a gun too. So like you can defend yourself.
Yeah.
And Fat Sal would talk about the fact that they discussed like surveillance, right? That was the first thing. And Sal Mangiavellano was kind of a younger guy, and he had a little bit more experience with like gadgets at this time, the internet. They were thinking about some sort of homemade device. They were going to mount some sort of bomb on his car. They considered a long-range sniper from like a building, and he characterized it as like a grassy knoll type of shooting, which, you know, we know where that comes from. But as we know, because Sammy Gravano's on YouTube currently, and he's been seen on this channel, you can see that here, we're in the right corner, he's still alive. Okay? So they didn't ever get to him. But the Gambino family was not only annoyed that he did what he did, they wanted retribution, but they also said a lot of it had to do with the fact that he wrote the book. He was very public about it. He was kind of thumbing his nose up at them, which is the reason for it. So this is all put in motion. The conversations from prison continue, but nothing ever gets done. So Peter Gotti, you know, ultimately has that issue because he never takes care of that. And this is something that we learn about the Gottis post John Sr. They never made right on a lot of things. Sammy Gravano, Bobby Borriello, a very close friend of the family, was killed. Junior did nothing about it. Nothing ever happened there. He didn't go after the Lucchese's for doing it. Nothing happened. You know, there's no retribution.
And I listen, I understand on some level the aversion to it. You know, you kind of want to turn the page and not bog everything down in the old battles of yesterday. The Gravano one, though, I'd have wanted that one. I'd have wanted.
Yeah, and I think this is the difference between we mentioned the golden age, right? You know, late 70s, 80s. It's a lot different. This is 1998.
There's no way. Listen, there's no way in my mind that dude can be out there doing interviews with 60 Minutes, writing books, talking about like it just can't happen.
Well,
Just
this was my question of like, why do this to begin with? Like this, they knew this was a different time, right? They knew they probably weren't going to get to him. And even if they did, there was going to be they're going to all get life for it. But again, I guess they looked at it and said, we're gangsters. This is what we do. And, you know, we'll pay for it regardless. Now, I want to talk about 1999 because that's a big year for Peter Gotti. As we know, 1998, 1999, Junior Gotti's indicted, taken off the street. Peter Gotti becomes the de facto head of the Gambino crime family. Think of it. 20 years before, he was a sanitation worker.
It's a quick rise.
Nothing wrong with that. Great civil service job. Not exactly something you would think about, right? And I think what we would learn about Peter Gotti's reign is the fact that he was very ostracized, right? You know, we would learn that Jimmy Brown Failure would have trash meetings and not even call him to come to the meeting. Like nobody cared. Danny Marino, a Gotti, anti-Gotti guy, a lot of his career, very affiliated with Paul Castellano. They would withhold envelopes. I mean, people would decline promotions. At one point, Mikey Scars was asked to be consigliere. He declined. There was also a story that Mikey told recently on his Patreon about at one point they had a party for Mikey Scars in Brooklyn. It was like some sort of soiree. Someone had the idea, we should call Pete and have him come down. Somebody calls Peter and Peter's told to come down. Peter believed he was being called for a meeting. He comes to this catering hall and there's a big party. Mikey Scars says Peter walks in and starts screaming, "Where's my boss? You know, where's my boss?" He makes a big deal about it. Mikey walks up. "What are you doing?" Hands him 10 grand. And immediately Peter starts backtracking and says, "Oh, sorry. You know, I thought you wanted me for something." You know, it was always about money for him, right? That was always what it was about. And people didn't respect him. Like people didn't realize, like maybe they kind of didn't respect Junior. They really didn't respect Peter, right? And they just kind of started thumbing their nose up. They did their own thing. But I will say this, Peter Gotti's making money on the street. He can be seen. I mean, this is a pretty damning photo for him here. Peter's in the middle, Primo Casarano on the left, Jerome Brancato on the right. Both these guys that Peter's with are very high ranking on the Brooklyn waterfront, right? They're very connected to Sonny Saccone, who was a maven on the waterfront. He was the waterfront guy. He was put up there by Gotti. These guys are making a lot of money on the waterfront through extortion, the ILA, all that sort of thing. For Peter Gotti, it would all come tumbling down on June 4th, 2002, just about 2 weeks before the death of his brother John in federal prison. Peter Gotti is indicted by the federal government on federal racketeering charges. Also in the indictment, Sonny Ciccone, Jerome Brancato, his brother Richie Gotti, and Primo Casarino. Now, the problem will lie here in just a moment, which we'll get into. But I want to talk about a statement that Primo Casarino makes. Casarino becomes a federal cooperator very quickly, and he decides to flip on his family. Now, I want to talk about this quote. This is damning for Peter Gotti from Primo Casarino. In the co-defendant meeting on a return to MDC Brooklyn in and around 2002, Peter Gotti refused a global plea offer and ordered various people in the family, including Jerome Brancato, to not take pleas. Peter Gotti, according to Casarino, leaned back in his chair. Richie Gotti was across the table, and sitting next to Richie Gotti was another individual. His nephew was there. Sonny Ciccone was talking with his lawyer. Peter Gotti would then make a motion with a gun and said, quote, "Anybody take a plea, like them and their family, kill them and their family." He would make sure Jerome Brancato didn't take a plea. So again, this is problematic because again, Gotti's telling his people, don't take pleas, don't take pleas. They don't take pleas. And guess what, Blackjack? What happens when you don't take a plea?
Yeah, I mean, one of two things happens. Either you flip or you go to prison.
Right. And in 2003, we know Peter Gotti wouldn't flip. He would be sentenced to just over 9 years in federal prison. after being convicted for the waterfront extortions. Now, I'm not going to go into, a lot of people are going to ask me about the extortion attempt of Steven Seagal, the actor.
Yeah,
I've done a video on that. I will say, I think a lot of it was like Peter Gotti didn't extort Steven Seagal. Okay. People in the Gambino family tried to extort him, and it was just rolled up to Peter. Peter did not attempt to extort anybody. Okay. He may have tried to extort other people, but not Seagal. Okay. So that story is a little bit kind of, you include the name Gotti, people are going to watch it, right? But 2003 is a bad year for Gotti. Gets convicted. Even after his longtime girlfriend, Marjorie Alexander, sent letters talking about how great he was. Not only does he get 9 years in prison, but his wife, Catherine, after 43 years of marriage, files for divorce. What she ultimately finds is love letters from Marjorie Alexander. And what happens is Marjorie goes public, which makes Gotti furious in prison. She writes a letter to the judge talking about how great he is. At one point, she would say, quote, "I'm proud of loving him."
I mean, it's a bold move to have your mistress write a character reference to the judge in your criminal case. It's a bold move. That's all I'm saying.
And I think, and what we'll learn is Peter Gotti loved Marjorie Alexander, right? I'll talk about what happens to her. And this is a pretty sad story. Marjorie Alexander, I guess, in 2004, Peter Gotti's now facing new charges, extortion charges, and the murder conspiracy to kill Sammy Gravano is hit against him. He's facing life, basically. Peter Gotti's in his 60s at this point. You get 25 years. That's probably life for you, right? And we know the mob is hated, so he's not going to get out. So he's facing a lot. Things are really coming down on him. He gets pissed off about Marjorie going to the papers and stuff. He gives her a call, and they talk in 2004, in April of 2004. Within 3 hours, Marjorie Alexander tells her husband, her estranged husband, that she needs just a night to unwind on her own. She checks into this Red Roof Inn in Westbury, Long Island, just 3 hours after speaking to her beau, Peter Gotti. In the late evening hours of April 1st, 2004, Marjorie Alexander writes various letters and mails them out. She sends them to her family. She also leaves a note for the maid telling them that she's sorry and leaves a $100 tip. From then on, it would be said that Marjorie Alexander would take various antidepressants and put multiple bags over her head with duct tape. She would be found next day in what cops would say was an apparent suicide at the motel. Now, Gerald Shargell, the longtime lawyer for the Gottis, and at one point Peter Gotti, would say that Peter was, quote, very much in love with Miss Alexander. The devastation for him is beyond words. Now, we can say that was probably very true. Whether you like the Gottis or not, they are people in the end, and they had people they cared about. The whole, like, and this is something that the papers have done over the years, putting the Gottis into things you have no proof of. Like, I saw one person say essentially that maybe this was because she talked to the police and or the papers, and maybe they killed her. And it's like, no, she killed herself. She was it was a very sad situation. And you'd have to think, I mean, this probably jammed Peter up pretty bad. We have to admit, 2003 and 2004, pretty bad years for Peter Gotti.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, obviously, terrible. And, you know, like you said at the beginning of this, a terrible story, you know, with her taking her own life like that. I mean, I'd love to know what was said on that phone call. Because
I think it was probably, look, and maybe Peter Gotti accepted the fact that his wife was leaving him, but this was going to be a problem for him. I mean, she was going to take a lot of his money. Hey, that's how divorces work. And by this point, his brother's dead. His nephew's in jail. Nobody respected him on the street. You think they're sending money to him?
Listen, you know, it's ironic in a lot of ways because John Gotti got the platinum treatment from the press, right? The media loved John Gotti, you know, the Teflon Don. They didn't call Peter the same thing.
No, and they're calling him the dumb Don.
The dumbest Don is
for sure.
You'll find out there, and you know that kind of sucks.
It would get worse for Peter Gotti, though. Surprisingly, he would find out that various members of the Gambino crime family were turning against him, including Mikey Scars, as well as Fat Salvatore Mangiavellana. Now, this was concerning for him. And Fat Sal would basically say, when asked by Assistant Attorney Victor who ordered the hit on Gravano, Mangiavellana would calmly respond, Peter Gotti. So this was pretty bad for him. He would ultimately be convicted of this case. Peter Gotti was hit with a 25-year prison sentence. He would be sent and had to realize the fact that he may never get out of prison again. In 2005, when he was sentenced, his scheduled release date was September 10th, 2031. Now, I want to talk about in 2007 what would happen, because this was pretty sad because, again, the people that I feel most bad for are the families of these people. They don't ask for this stuff. I guess maybe they're a little jaded when they meet these people. So, for instance, Peter Gotti's wife, right?
Yeah.
When she met him, he was a sanitation worker, right?
Mm-hmm.
She didn't know he would become the boss of the Gambino crime family. Maybe she was a little jaded and not realizing who his brothers were. But in 2007, the wife of Peter Gotti, Catherine Gotti, would file for essentially his pension. Peter Gotti was receiving $2,011 a month in pension payments from the city of New York. Now, she would be allowed to earn about 71% of that. However, though, according to the fact that the government was garnishing all the payments that Peter Gotti was reporting, she didn't actually get any of it. In January of 2005, there was a writ of garnishment permits. Amounts of pension owned by Gotti and him should not be subject. So they basically filed that it should not be available for garnishment. In the end, it wouldn't matter. She didn't win anything. Now, at one point, Peter Gotti's wife in her 70s had to resort to taking a job as a receptionist for, guess what? She didn't have any money. So this goes to show you, people, what does the mafia actually do for you? This was a person who was married to a Gotti. Where was the rest of the family in all this?
It's a great question.
I mean, it's actually pretty sad. I mean, you know, and from what I understand, Catherine Gotti's...
One thing, though, Jeff, just to point out, she did divorce him. I mean,
Sure.
maybe if she doesn't divorce him, this is a different ballgame, but she did.
And I'm sure, I mean, there was some money there, but I'm sure it wasn't a ton. I mean, he had legal bills. I mean, who knows what debt he was in. I mean, it's a tough situation for her. From what I understand, she's still alive, as far as I know, and pretty much is living out the rest of her life in probably New York somewhere. Ultimately, Peter Gotti would file for compassionate release under the First Step Act multiple times, including in July of 2019, as well as in late 2019. Now, the problem that Gotti had, and this had been talked about in the 2000s, he had various health ailments. He had gout, thyroid problems, all sorts of issues, which are not pleasant in prison. It's not like they're giving you some sort of, great care in there. You're at a medical center for federal prisoners in Butner, and you're, you know who your caregivers are in there, right? Other gangsters, other people, right? They just put people who may be nice and they put them in control of, caregiving duties. So it's not like you're given much, help. Peter Gotti would die in February of 2021 at FCI Butner. He was 81 years old. And we look at the current landscape of the Gotti name in the mob. It is pretty much extinguished. In fact, it is extinguished. From what I know, there is no current Gotti connected to the mafia. Now, there are two brothers, Richie and Vinny. From what I understand, they have been shelved and they are no longer connected to the family. We've talked before. One of the grandsons has been doing prison time for some association to the mob. But other than that, they're out of that world. Okay, it's been about 20 years since they were connected to it. And one of the last people connected was Peter Gotti. Will we recognize him a lot? Not really. We mostly think of John Sr., John Jr., maybe Victoria even. But Peter Gotti's kind of a sad tale, right? I mean, he's just kind of through association, didn't have much, decided to go into that world. And in the end, did some pretty dumb things. I mean, let's say he doesn't get involved.
He got the 25 years, but he didn't get Sammy. I mean, it's the worst possible outcome, right? Is like you do the time for it, but you don't do the thing.
Well, let's figure in 2004, he was given 9 years. He probably did 7. He'd have been out by 2011. And what would have happened? He would have been Gene Gotti. Gene Gotti got out a couple of years ago. We haven't heard a peep from him. He's just living his life, you know, doing his thing. But, you know, the problem that a lot of people don't understand is a lot of these old gangsters, when you stop being involved with the mob, guess what? Your money goes away. It's hard to live, you know, on meager amounts, man.
It is, but I mean, I think that Gene took the smart route because I think it's been made so clear that, you know, if your last name is Gotti, the federal government's got a hard on for you, and they don't let things go. So, you know, if you want to live out your time in peace, you gotta just go away.
Exactly. And nowadays it's there's no real reason to be a part of it. So that's that for that. Peter Gotti on the sit down. We hope you enjoyed the show as always. Hope you learned something. Black Jew, it was good to have you back. Hopefully we have you back often whenever we do a show on the mob. It's good to have banter. Sometimes it's hard to do a show on your own. So it's nice to have someone here and to kind of go back and forth with. It's kind of that down year right now. It's July. There's not a ton going on. We're just kind of bridging the gap to football and that sort of thing. So it's nice to have you back and able to do some things again. How's Florida, by the way?
No, it's hot right now. Real hot.
It's pretty hot.
But otherwise, great.
Yeah. Well, that's Florida for you. I mean, you look very Florida-like. You have a pink and purple shirt on. You look like you're, you know, going out to the cabana here soon. What's it, a Wyoming football hat? Is that what that is?
It's just the state seal of Wyoming. I picked it up when I was out there a few years ago.
There's my corny college football brain for you. But yeah, so that's that. Another great episode. Before we go, please make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you subscribe if you're watching us. Check out all of us, what we do on social. Follow Blackjack at Blackjack Fletch. Follow me at Jeff Nadu. Also, I want to tell everybody, check us out on all the streaming platforms, wherever you're listening. If you're listening on audio, check us out on YouTube. And if you're on YouTube, check us out on audio. Because here's what I'll tell you guys. And I don't talk about this on YouTube that much, and I probably should. Most of the episodes Blackjack and I did early on, Tony Accardo, Tony Salerno, Tony Corralo, all these different people, they are not on YouTube. So go check us out on iTunes or Spotify and subscribe because you can get a lot of back episodes, right? So you want to get those golden age episodes. So go check those all out now. Blackjack, thanks for coming on. Good to see you.
Anytime, brother. Anytime.
We'll see you all next week here on The Sit Down.